He left the White House before dawn. No handshake, no farewell. John Adams would not stay to watch his former friend take the oath. The man who had once asked Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence now could not bear to be in the same city as him. His carriage rolled out of Washington in the dark. Behind him, the Capitol prepared for a new president, one he had come to see not as a rival but as a threat to everything he had built. And that was only the beginning. The story of American presidents who secretly or not so secretly despised each other runs straight through the heart of the Republic. Some of these grudges started in friendship, some never ended. What they shared was something darker than disagreement, a kind of hatred that shaped the nation itself, that decided elections, that sometimes outlived the men who carried it. In 1775, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson met in Philadelphia as delegates to the Continental Congress. Adams, blunt and restless, from New England. Jefferson, reserved and precise, from Virginia. They did not have to like each other. They became allies anyway. Adams pushed for Jefferson to draft the Declaration of Independence, believing he could write 10 times better than anyone else. Through the summer of 1776, they worked side by side, arguing over words and ideas in the heat of a Philadelphia summer. When the document was done, they had built something more than a partnership. They had built trust. For a time, that trust would hold, but a republic was young, and power would test it. But power would tear it apart. Adams believed in a strong central government. Jefferson feared it. When George Washington left office, the two men found themselves on opposite sides of every question. The French Revolution, the size of the army, the reach of the state. Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson saw them as an assault on liberty. By the election of 1800, they were no longer colleagues. They were rivals. Federalist pamphlets called Jefferson an atheist and a radical. Jefferson's supporters accused Adams of wanting to crown himself king. The campaign was vicious. When the votes were counted, Jefferson had won 73 electoral votes to Adams's 65. Adams had lost, and what happened next would define the rest of their lives. Adams refused to attend Jefferson's inauguration. He left the Capitol in the early hours of March 4, 1801. For the next 11 years, the two men did not exchange a single letter. The silence between them was total. Yet the story was not over. A mutual friend, the physician Benjamin Rush, dreamed that both men would one day write to each other again. He nudged them. Slowly, carefully, they began to write. The letters that followed are among the most remarkable in American history. Two old men, once the closest of allies, then the bitterest of foes, finally reckoning with what they had lost. They wrote about philosophy, about family, about the country they had helped create. They disagreed to the end on the role of government and the meaning of revolution. They never fully agreed. They did not have to. They had found their way back. Then came the twist that no one could have invented. On July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration they had championed, John Adams lay dying in Massachusetts. His last recorded words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died hours earlier in Virginia. The two men had left the world on the same day, in the same hour, still bound by a rivalry that had once been friendship, and a friendship that had once been rivalry. If you're enjoying this journey through the hidden tensions of the presidency, like this video and subscribe for more stories from American history every week. Another feud had no such reconciliation. It began with a stolen election. Or at least that was what half the country believed, and for Andrew Jackson, belief was enough. In 1824, Andrew Jackson won more popular votes and more electoral votes than any other candidate. He had 99 electoral votes. He needed 131 for a majority. He did not have them. The race went to the House of Representatives. There, Henry Clay, who had come in fourth, held the balance of power. Clay met with John Quincy Adams. Adams won the House vote. Weeks later, Adams named Clay his Secretary of State, the traditional path to the presidency. Jackson's supporters did not need proof of a deal. They had a name for it, the corrupt bargain. Adams and Clay denied it. Jackson himself never forgot it. He had been cheated, he believed, by the very system he had fought to defend. And the man in the White House was not a legitimate president. He was a thief. What followed was 4 years of smoldering resentment. When the two men faced each other again in 1828, the campaign sank to a level of personal attack that had never been seen before. Adams's allies accused Jackson of adultery and murder. They dragged his wife, Rachel, into the spotlight. Jackson had married her before her divorce from her first husband was final. They had remarried legally as soon as the divorce was complete. To his enemies, that made him an adulterer. The pamphlets and speeches did not spare Rachel. She was attacked in print. She had long suffered from heart trouble. The strain of the campaign made it worse. She died in December 1828, weeks before her husband's inauguration. Jackson buried her and then went to Washington. He believed the Adams camp had killed her. He would never forgive John Quincy Adams. The two men had become more than political opponents. They were enemies for life. Adams would live until 1848. He never apologized. Jackson never asked him to. The era of good feelings had ended. In its place was something raw. The birth of modern party politics and a hatred that had turned a stolen election into a war that never really ended. The next rupture was different. This one was not between strangers. It was between a president and the man he had chosen to replace him. And it would tear a political party in half. Theodore Roosevelt left the White House in 1909. He had served 2 terms. He handpicked William Howard Taft as his successor. Taft had been his friend, his ally, his Secretary of War. Roosevelt believed Taft would continue his progressive reforms, would protect the forests and break the trusts and carry the torch. For a while, it seemed he might. Then Taft broke with Roosevelt's conservation policies. He fired Gifford Pinchot, Roosevelt's close friend and the head of the Forest Service. He pursued antitrust cases against companies Roosevelt had personally approved, including United States Steel. To Roosevelt, it was not just policy. It was betrayal. The man he had trusted had turned his back on everything they had built. By 1912, Roosevelt wanted his party back. He declared his candidacy with the phrase that would define him, "My hat is in the ring." The Republican convention in Chicago that summer was chaos. Roosevelt's supporters believed the nomination was being stolen. Taft's machine had locked up the delegates through months of careful organizing. When Taft won, Roosevelt did not simply accept defeat. He walked out. He formed a new party, the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, and ran against Taft in the general election. The result was disaster for both men. The Republican vote split. Democrat Woodrow Wilson won the White House. Roosevelt had destroyed the party to punish the man who had once been his heir. Taft would later call the rupture the worst experience of his political life. He had wanted to be a different kind of president than Roosevelt. He had not wanted to be his enemy, but the breach was final. The friendship was over. It would never recover. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the presidents who could not stand each other, like the video and subscribe for more weekly history breakdowns. One more feud would shape the 20th century. It began in friendship and it would end in something far darker. It began with a train ride and a shared bunk. Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy met in 1947 as first-term congressmen. They served on the same committee, Education and Labor. They debated each other in Pennsylvania and then shared sandwiches and talked baseball. On the train back to Washington, they drew straws for the bottom bunk and stayed up talking. Observers noted something unexpected: genuine friendliness. They were not natural allies. Nixon was the son of a struggling California family. Kennedy was the son of wealth and privilege, with a father who had built a fortune and expected his sons to rule. But for a few years they got along. That would not last. Then came 1960. They ran against each other for the presidency. The debates were televised. Kennedy looked calm and confident. Nixon looked tired and uneasy. The election was extraordinarily close. Kennedy won. Nixon never got over it. He had lost to a man he had once considered a colleague. Worse, he had lost to a style, to charm, to ease, to a name that opened every door. Historians have documented how Nixon's obsession with the Kennedys would deepen over the years. It would fuel his return to politics, his victory in 1968, and eventually the paranoia and rage that would destroy his presidency. Even after Kennedy's death, Nixon would face his brothers Robert and Edward as rivals. The obsession would outlive the man. The hatred had started in a train car. It would end in disgrace, in resignation, in the ruin of a presidency that had once seemed unstoppable. Behind the speeches and the handshakes, American history has always been shaped by men who could not stand each other. The cameras showed unity. The letters in the private rooms told another story. Some made peace, some never did. The grudges between Adams and Jefferson, Jackson and Adams, Roosevelt and Taft, Nixon and Kennedy, they were not footnotes. They were forces. They decided elections, split parties, and sometimes cost lives. The hatreds were real. So were the consequences. Adams and Jefferson died on the same day. Rachel Jackson did not live to see her husband take the oath. The Republican Party shattered in 1912. A presidency collapsed in Watergate. The feuds were never just personal. They shaped laws, they decided who held power, and they left scars that lasted decades. In that tension between the public unity and the private fury, the American presidency found some of its darkest and most human moments. The men who held the office were not monuments. They were rivals, friends, and sometimes enemies. And the hatreds they carried changed the country forever. That is the story the history books do not always tell. But it is the one that shaped the Oval Office from the very beginning.